Okay, so I am.
Wait. Sorry, we're not live yet. Sorry, we're not quite live yet, Erin. I'll come back to you one moment. Order. Welcome to this session of the Foreign Affairs Committee looking at the UK's engagement in Central Asia. Thank you to both of our guests for joining us today. Mr. Garrett, if you can kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Charles Garrett. I was British Ambassador to Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan from 2019 to 2022, and I left the Foreign Office in February of this year.
Arian, please.
Yes, my name is Arvan Dosenbecker from the managing partner for Ernst & Young in Caucasus and Central Asia. Central Asia in particular includes Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And I also, am the chairman of Foreign Investors Council in Kazakhstan and the chairman of European Association of Companies in Kazakhstan.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, have senior ministers neglected Central Asia?
I don't know whether I'd choose the word neglected Central Asia, but certainly Britain could achieve a lot more with greater frequency and quality of senior official and ministerial time.
Do you feel, in terms of not just ministerial time, but in terms of the basic resourcing, so the size of our posts, where we have posts, the amount of staff we have, is any of that adequate to what you believe to be the potential of the region?
It's all grown up sort of slightly piecemeal over the years since the independence of those five countries. So, for example, the opportunities that are available in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan were recognised with significantly staffed and resourced embassies. The embassy in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan was set up only in 2010 after the events of the ethnic clashes in Osh of that year persuaded the Foreign Office that it was time to have someone on the ground there rather than covering it from Kazakhstan. So I would say that while parts of the network in Central Asia are well resourced, other parts are run on a bit of a shoestring, and I would say that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are very much in that category. But across the board, I would say there's insufficient resources given to the programmes and other diplomatic activity.
And Mr. Dosimbekov, how do you see the UK from being sat in the region? Do you think it feels like we're giving enough attention to the region? And what do you think really the UK has to gain from investing significantly in Central Asia?
Well, I think UK has done, if not enough, then large amounts. The connection between UK and Kazakhstan in particular has been very strong in the last 20-odd years. If you look at the overall investment, it is quite sizable compared to some other countries. Obviously, there are opportunities in the region, which is rich in natural resources and is now diversifying its economy, across different countries such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan in particular. There's lots of reforms happening in Uzbekistan. The legislative base is becoming a lot more transparent. There are many opportunities, obviously, here. Now, whether or not the UK has done enough, obviously, I think you could do more. Particularly with the carbon neutral agenda in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and some other large projects that are happening or will be happening. Obviously, the UK is held in high regard here. If you look at some of the state-owned companies and banks, their boards of directors have a lot of UK citizens on them. So like I said, the connection has been, relatively strong over the years, and the UK is considered to be one of the, if not largest, but at least one of the most consistent investors in the region, particularly in Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan is opening up, as you know.
And do you think the UK has clear objectives for what it wants to achieve in Central Asian countries?
Well, I mean, it's been pretty consistent. I think there is an objective. Obviously, I've been in touch with the UK embassy here, and development of entrepreneurship, which is where I think the UK could be pretty useful, providing sharing experience. So there is an agenda, there is a goal, I believe. However, unfortunately, during the COVID times, and then followed by the war in Ukraine, There's been a bit of a slowdown maybe overall in the region economically, as you know. On the other hand, Kazakhstan, Central Asia in particular, and through the Caspian, some of the transportation routes have become a lot more important in terms of imports and exports, and that way Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries, as well as the Caucasus, are gaining a lot more prominence right now. So I think the UK are watching this, at least from my discussions with the UK, with the British business community, from my discussions with the ambassador here. I think you're watching this very, very closely and looking for opportunities. But on the other hand, I believe maybe a more dynamic investment activity, a more dynamic, on the operational level at least, I think could be more useful.
Very briefly, before I turn to Liam, Charles, look, is our focus just seasonal labour and trade, or do you think we have meaningful objectives that we are trying to achieve in our partnerships with these countries?
No, we absolutely do have meaningful objectives in Central Asia, and stability is right at the centre of that. It really doesn't serve British interests if instability becomes more of a threat, more of a reality in Central Asia. And so, putting money into, for example, strengthening border communities to try to mitigate the risk of the kind of border conflict we've seen between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan is really money well spent. And we do put quite a lot of effort into that.
Thank you so much, Liam.
Thanks so much. Mr. Garrett, can I just ask, I just wanted to get a sense first of, if we could be doing more and should be doing more, what is the prize beyond stability that we're trying to unlock for the UK, do you think?
I think there's a lot we can do in terms of responding to the desire expressed to a greater or lesser degree, by all 5 of the Central Asian countries for what they call a multi-vector foreign policy. Mm-hmm. In other words, they all have a very deep and broad connection with Moscow for historic reasons. It's a social, economic, cultural, historical relationship. And they have, of course, powerful commercial links with Beijing. But, they've all said at times that they would like to diversify those relationships. And I would say that's not always been necessarily an open door, but one of the opportunities, I would say, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year has been that people in power, certainly in Kyrgyzstan, and I sense in other countries in Central Asia as well, feel that that's a bit of a missed opportunity. They should have been doing more to develop relationships with the UK, with the US, with the European Union and others over previous years, and would like to do more about that now. So that is something we should be doing. There are many other areas as well, because of course stability is not just about border conflict and so on. It's also about reducing the risk of popular unrest, for example. And there are many ways that we can work with the countries in Central Asia to strengthen public resilience, if you like, and reduce the risk of unrest. One of those ways is through the kind of work we've been doing with small and medium-sized enterprises and in the creative sectors as well, which has not only a powerful benefit for the economies of those countries, it also has a social impact as well, because a lot of the smaller businesses that we've been able to support employ women, for example. They're active in rural communities, not just in the big cities. They include people with disabilities and so on. And that kind of thing can have a stabilising effect as well at a grassroots level. So that's very important work.
In supporting a multi-vector foreign policy, do we help constrain an overmighty Russia by helping ensure that Central Asian countries do have greater agency and autonomy than perhaps they did in the past?
I think it's not necessarily helpful to see it in the context of constraining Moscow, because the connection to Moscow is incredibly powerful. You only have to look back on the 9th of May this year, when all 5 heads of government were in Moscow for Russia's celebration of the end of the Second World War. None of them really wanted to be there, but they all went there. And no doubt because of immense pressure from Moscow. I see it less in terms of constraining Moscow, more in terms of opening up other avenues for them and finding opportunities for mutual benefit. For example, in the field of climate change or other UN business.
We heard a lot when we were there about the virtues of British soft power, and we heard a lot about how British soft power is underinvested. Is that your perspective too? Do you think soft power investments do have a yield? And if you were investing more, where would you put it?
They absolutely do have a yield, and I saw that when I first went out in 2019. The British Council still had an initiative called Creative Central Asia, which was a really excellent initiative for getting the countries of the region to focus on the opportunities, their economic opportunities and development opportunities in that field. And it worked extremely well, and it developed collaboration and cooperation between the countries as well, which again is very useful in terms of our wider objectives. So that sort of thing has been very effective in the past. It withered during the pandemic, and the British Council hasn't been able to resurrect it since. That is somewhere where there is a lot of where Britain has a fantastic reputation, frankly, and we're not doing enough to exploit that and influence people through that channel. English language is another area where we could be doing a lot more. There's an enormous amount of money put into supporting Russian language training in parts of the region. Very little money goes into English language training. But of course, everyone that you teach to learn English has a much wider range of sources they can draw their news from online. If they only have Russian, then they only get RT and other Moscow-based resources. So there are two areas. There are many others, and we should be putting a lot more money into that. Evening, I should mention.
Seasonal agricultural worker scheme another opportunity?
It is.
How would you enhance that, do you think?
Well, I think so long as the Home Office are confident that it's not treading over their needs for controlling immigration into this country, then expanding that scheme for Central Asian nationals is a very good way of having a contribution on the economic side, because they earn as economic migrants in the UK, they earn a whole lot more than they do in Kazakhstan or Russia. And B, in terms of opening their eyes to the West and seeing an example of a country which is run on a democratic basis with the rule of law.
Creative economy, English, chevening, labour agreements, those are 4 opportunities for soft power.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much. Royston.
You talked about earlier about wanting to diversify away from perhaps China and Russia. Is there an advantage there then for doing business with UK businesses that we should be exploiting more than we do?
Yes, there almost certainly is. But I mean, the area of business collaboration, whether it's investment or import-export, is fraught with difficulties. I mean, one of the biggest challenge, certainly from a Kyrgyz point of view, and it's to perhaps a lesser extent a problem in other parts of Central Asia, is the lack of rule of law means that you're walking through a minefield, and your investment and your resources, your time is always at risk. But the big opportunities there lie in Uzbekistan, I would say, and Kazakhstan, which are much bigger economies, much richer economies, and have a longer track record of connections, of collaboration with British businesses.
And do British businesses, where would they get that information? Where would they see that as a market? And then where would they potentially start down that road, but then find it's all too complicated? I mean, do they already know that, or do they just not even look in that direction?
Well, some businesses in some sectors already know about it. I mean, if you're in the mining sector, then Central Asia is on your radar probably quite significantly. But in other areas, it depends on the kind of networking or conversations with business sector associations like British Expertise International, which has run some very good seminars and meetings on business opportunities in Central Asia for their members. That kind of outreach from embassies, British embassies in the region, can be quite successful in terms of getting businesses in Britain to focus on opportunities in Central Asia and also telling them about the realities of doing business there.
Yes. Mr. Dosimbekov, do you want to comment on any of those points?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do agree that British soft power is may have an influence here, particularly when it comes to development of entrepreneurship. Mr. Garrett mentioned creative industries. This is something that Kazakhstan is taking very close look at. Understanding that the UK has a great experience here, then sharing it with Kazakhstan and promoting some of it here would be very useful. In terms of financial services, for example, and in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan in particular, there's as we talked about, diversifying the economy, and unfortunately, financial and business services are not getting as much attention and have not had, as many projects as some other services, such as transportation and logistics, for understandable reasons. However, Kazakhstan has created what they call an Astana International Financial Center, which has its own tax regime, has its own legislation. English law, is applied there for dispute resolution in particular. They have hired about 500, judges from the UK to work in the Astana Financial Center. So there's clearly development in that area as well. So all of that put together, I think, creates a good opportunity for, on the back of the existing experiences, to penetrate further into Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and even Kyrgyzstan to a certain extent, which, as Mr. Garrett said, is a much smaller economy. Now, in terms of how we get this information, obviously there are large investors in the country, not only from the UK, but from other parts of the world. And in Kazakhstan has been always sort of multi-vector, and we have lots of companies from different parts of the world. In the last 10 or 15 years, Kazakhstan has attracted $300 billion in foreign direct investment. But then also what these countries do, Kazakhstan in particular, and Uzbekistan for that matter, they go on roadshows. Yeah, they go to places like London, they meet with businesses, they try to, sell investment opportunities in this part of the world. So that's also a reliable, yet less known source of information.
Okay, Graham.
Being ambassador must be fraught with a lot of ethical dilemmas while you try to pursue human rights from a country with a liberal history. How do you maintain trust while pursuing an agenda which the country is not that sympathetic to?
It's a very good question, actually, and it's one that throughout my time as ambassador in Bishkek, I had to keep at the front of my mind, because unlike many other countries in the world, you don't carry much credit when you arrive as an ambassador from Great Britain in that part of the world, especially in the field of human rights, because although they know you might kind of have a point, they're not inclined particularly to listen to you in a constructive way. So one has to take a more nuanced approach. And I found that the best way of doing it was not to criticise head-on or address things head-on even, but to find different ways into human rights issues. So for example, we had a very successful project on eradicating torture in prisons, which was a major human rights problem in Kyrgyzstan. It did some very good work, that project, and it was something which the government were keen to engage on, because it wasn't something they found difficult. But there are other human rights issues, especially personal ones involving individuals who have been imprisoned unfairly, for example, where a direct head-on approach might just get the wrong kind of response, and not only, you know, sort of a sort of firm rejection in the context of that particular case, but it would have a negative impact on other things that the embassy was trying to achieve. So one needed to approach that sort of thing very carefully. Another way that I found was quite effective on the human rights side, especially in areas like inclusion of people with disabilities or women's rights, for example, was to work through projects which were designed to develop small and medium-sized enterprises and focus those on ensuring that that the employment generated by that work benefited those people. So you're kind of doing it under the radar. You're making a difference on important human rights issues, but without attracting the kind of negative response that you could in other areas.
You've sort of partially answered my next follow-up question, which was to ask you for a solid example of success in human rights, and you've answered that by talking about torture in prisons. It seems slightly strange that the government were keen on that and why they'd not done it themselves. Can you just expand a little bit on how you achieved that success?
I suspect the reason why they were keener on that than they were on on engaging on individual cases of human rights transgressions was because they were able to distance themselves to some extent from it. You know, they were able to admit that the problem of torture within the prison system existed because they could lay the blame at the door of the people operating within the prison system. So it wasn't actually sort of reflecting directly on them or their or judges, for example. So they were able to stand back and share with us any sort of joy at a successful outcome.
Thank you. Erin, can you tell us, while pursuing commercial interests, whether you have come across situations where it has exacerbated, made worse, the human rights issues, and how do you avoid that situation?
I'm sorry, is that a question to me?
Yes, it was.
Right. Well, I personally haven't come across major, violations in this area. I mean, referring to Kazakhstan in particular, and maybe looking at a lighter version of human rights, if you wish, there seems to be a growing, awareness particularly when it comes to large local businesses and the way they treat their employees. In the areas of wellness and other support that companies could provide, they're starting to use more and more of experiences that come from the West. And luckily, we have a lot of Western companies here that as part of their employee policies include human rights in the first place, and companies are following those experiences. Now, when it comes to smaller businesses, or obviously there's companies that could businesses that could violate, I haven't really come across myself, but I could say that generally in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, for that matter, I think there's growing awareness, and these countries trying to follow sort of Western standards and understanding that this is something that they will be scrutinized for, sooner or later. I think there's a culture that's shaping up, and it's improving.
Thank you. Can I just ask both witnesses to explain very, very briefly, because we're running out of time, what would be the consequences of disengaging, at least partially?
You mean in a diplomatic sense?
Diplomatic and economic consequences.
Yes. I mean, there would be, and Erlan will be able to speak to this more with more authority than I can, economic disadvantage from disengaging from an economy like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. I mean, there are British companies which have very significant interests there, and there are opportunities which they would be missing out on. Diplomatically, I think we would not be able to influence the kind of objectives that we've been aiming for in Central Asia around stability and so on, and strengthening democracy, strengthening the rule of law and so on. We would lose that ability. I think we would also not be answering the government's request for support in developing their multi-vector foreign policy, and we would also be missing out on opportunities in the international organisations in which countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are members. So for example, it was only through the efforts of the British Embassy in Bishkek, working with the UN Development Programme, that we were able to persuade the President of Kyrgyzstan to attend COP26 in Glasgow, which was a very effective step forward in raising awareness and understanding of the problems of climate change in Central Asia, and gave a good push to our international efforts as President of the COP system. So opportunities like that we would be missing out on. And I think it would be a mistake to do that. And I think that with additional resources, not all that much, one could identify and do something about other similar opportunities.
Thank you. Arian, can you answer the same question?
Yes, very briefly. I think obviously, disengaging would not be good for any of these countries in Central Asia. As I said, Kazakhstan has had a long Kazakhstan has had a long connection with the UK for many years now. There's economic interest that UK companies are pursuing here. As I said, there's lots of opportunities, and there are many other countries that are investing in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and even Kyrgyzstan, right? So if the UK was to, were to disengage, you would stand out as one of the major countries that has no relationship with Kazakhstan, at least economically, for the time being. I would also look at it not necessarily in the context of the Russian, and Chinese influence that Mr. Garrett has covered as well in his responses, but I would look at it from the point of view of providing sort of a balanced opportunity for Central Asian countries, not only from Russia and China, but Western countries, of which UK is a major player. So I think disengaging would not be good for us, at least, and for the UK. I think there's lots of opportunities here. There are existing businesses from the UK in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So I don't think it would be a good thing for them to all of a sudden have to pull out and forget about this part of the world, at least for now. And I also wanted to mention that recently I've met with the U.S. authorities, in particular export control and financial control, that came to Kazakhstan to, basically check on how we're doing in terms of complying with the sanctions, applied by the U.S. and European Union. And we had a similar conversation. And my message to them was that, if there are any sort of ambition that Western countries, in particular the U.S., want to realize in this part of the world, then the Central Asian countries, particularly Kazakhstan, would be, the platform to do it, particularly given how, open the government and the people of Kazakhstan are to foreign investors, and how welcoming they have been, all along. Yeah.
Thank you.
Erlen, thank you. Excuse our subtle change of chair. Before I bring in Sir Chris Bryant, can I just check one point, which is your view on what role the UK can play in actually helping drive a healthier, cleaner business environment in this region?
Well, as I said, it's all about setting the right example, sharing experiences. These countries are big on developing their local entrepreneurship, which, I must say, unfortunately hasn't been developed to the required standard just yet. So countries like the UK can share their rich experiences in providing the framework for entrepreneurship development. Yeah, we talked in particular about creative industries. That's just a very specific example. But generally, by demonstrating how the rule of law, proper governance, transparency of the legislation, and consistent law application and court practices help businesses to thrive. And I think the UK is extremely well positioned in this sense, not only because you have a rich history of all of these aspects being developed in your country, for many, many years, but also, the respect that the UK businesses and the UK in general, command in some of these countries. Like I said, Kazakhstan has had a long connection. We have a lot of respect for British businesses. Like I said, there are boards of directors that contain people from the UK. So like I said, there's been a lot of attention paid to this country in particular as an existing investor, as somebody who could help develop relevant expertise and experiences. And Kazakhstan is actually looking up to some of the UK experiences to be used here. So that way, I think we can create a healthier, a more sustainable and consistent environment for businesses here, including local entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Finally, Sir Chris Bryant.
When we were in Tashkent and Astana, we were shown Parliament buildings. I think in Tashkent it was that they had a white carpet throughout the Parliament building, which suggested that not many people really ever went there. And I got the feeling in both Uzbekistan and in Kazakhstan that there was a bit of uncertainty about whether to go more democratic, more open, or not. And I just wonder what your assessment is, in particular of those two countries.
I think that's been a question ever since independence, I think in the 90s, actually. There's been in all of the countries, bar possibly Turkmenistan, and more recently Tajikistan, quite a debate about sort of how much political freedom to allow, and indeed whether to go for a more parliamentary system or a more presidential system. In Kyrgyzstan, they changed from a parliamentary system to presidential.
Sorry, when you say presidential, you mean presidential without the normal checks and balances?
Exactly, with a bit of a sort of a nominal parliamentary check and balance, if you like. They changed from a more active, larger parliament to a smaller parliament with a much more heavily weighted presidential office about 3 years ago. In Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, as far as I'm aware, it's much more heavily weighted towards the presidential side. It has been for a long time. But this is a live debate. I mean, it's not something which is a closed book.
And is that problematic in itself for the way in which contracts are awarded and because it's a system that's more open to corruption?
I'm not sure how much more open to corruption it is, actually. I think that corruption has flourished to a large degree in all of those countries since independence, regardless of what type of system they operate. But I think, I mean, you're right in the sense that in a stronger parliament you do get more scrutiny and more people speaking out. But in the case of Kyrgyzstan, which arguably has had the strongest parliament and the most freedom for MPs to speak out, it hasn't been a significant break on corruption.
Arian?
Well, I think in Kazakhstan in particular, there's been changes lately with the current president, who specifically said that he would like to empower parliament, to have a lot more flexibility, and it's probably happening slowly but surely. There's this new Kazakhstan concept where, there's political reforms, obviously tied to the relevant economic reforms, and there's growing understanding that economic reforms are not going to have any effect, if they're not backed by the proper political reforms that we have talked about for a long time. When it comes to state procurement rules, contract awarding, Kazakhstan in particular is looking to this very closely. There's been some improvements to the state procurement rules. They have cut down on a number of cases where you can do single source purchases from like a very large number to, 200 or something like that, which, still needs to be improved, but at least they're looking into it. And there's also, relatively strict anti-corruption laws in all of these countries. Now, whether or not they're followed in practice, 100%, of course, that's a question mark. Yeah, but at least there's this awareness. and you hear, very often about these corruption cases that are being pursued by the government. So, I think it's improving, at least in Kazakhstan. Uzbekistan, we'll see how it goes. I mean, it's a relatively new, it's an old country, but with new reforms happening, pretty much as we speak. So there's different level of development, I think, when it comes to comparison between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but they should follow suit. I mean, there is this realization that without proper political reforms and sufficient democracy, which will probably never be as much as in some of the most democratic countries in the West, at least not now, but there is this realization that economic reforms will not yield any tangible result.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap up there, but thanks to you both, because you've set the stage brilliantly for our next session with the Minister and Foreign Office officials. So can I thank you both for your evidence and testimony this afternoon. That's been extremely useful. Thank you very much. We're not going to suspend the session now. I think we're going to bring the Minister in from left field, from stage left, and roll straight on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, how are you?
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, I know. Just got used to it being nice and cool. Now it's too hot.
Sakib, do you want to just perhaps on WhatsApp just let me know? Yeah, well, Minister, welcome.
Thank you.
You'll forgive us that we've lost our chair to the debate downstairs, so left with us, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. You need no introduction, but Mr. Allen, do you want to just say a word of intro?
Absolutely. So my name is Chris Allen. I'm the Director for Eastern Europe and Central Asia in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as you would imagine, Development Office. I've been doing that job only for about 5 months, but I was previously also Ambassador in Tashkent for 4 years from 2015 to 2019, so I have some longer-term familiarity with the region. Please meet me.
Thank you. Minister, we might as well open the bowling with a basic question, really, which is about how you would define UK strategy in Central Asia. You're someone who has travelled a lot and studied a lot throughout the region. It's a region that you've known well for many years. How do you define the principal objectives of the UK's Central Asia strategy today?
Well, thank you very much, Liam. I think really at its heart is renewed engagement. It is. You will have noticed this. It's interesting to note that when the Foreign Secretary travelled to Kazakhstan in March, he was the first Foreign Secretary to have travelled there for 20 years. And if like me, you have a long-standing interest, and I know you do, in Central Asia, it's curious to note that even while we were engaged very significantly militarily in Afghanistan, neighbouring that region, the rate at which our ministers engaged and travelled across the region had waned. So I think first and foremost our approach and our strategy is to engage and work with those countries to help them meet the challenges that they face that are of concern to us all. And by that I mean really that given the geopolitical reality that they are countries sandwiched between two behemoths, China and Russia, on which they are substantially dependent for trade and with which they have extremely deep commercial relationships, which is only to be expected. Given that reality, where we have an opportunity to offer something unique is in helping them build their institutions in the post-Soviet era and help them improve their human capital, particularly with regard to English language and education. So I think really that's at the heart of our approach, is to engage, to help them build resilient, developed economies and to develop their human capital, because that's where we can actually compete, because we can't, of course, match the scale of China in terms of its commercial interests or the Russian market. Our competitive edge is in with institution building, English language, for which there is a very significant appetite, and I'm sure you will have seen that in your travels to Uzbekistan, not least. So I think really that's our approach, and I'm sure Chris...
Can I just pursue that for a second, though, because I'm especially keen on just trying to understand what are the prizes that you're trying to unlock. So when the committee was discussing the beginning of this inquiry in the first instance, one of the reasons that a number of us were interested in is whether there's an opportunity, for example, now to recontain Russia, given the ambitions for a multi-vector foreign policy. And I mean, I know you will have read Lord Curzon's 1889 travel through Central Asia, which was about the beginning of the Russian Empire in Central Asia. Well, now what we're watching across Central Asia is the end of that extraordinary history. But how do you see the prizes that we're trying to unlock for the UK, and to what extent does the question of trying to ensure that there is not an overmighty Russia, where does that loom in that set of objectives?
I think we've got to be very clear that the prize is ensuring the stable development and prosperity of Central Asia states. That's very good for them. It's good for us because that adds to the likelihood of there being peace in the region and them being resilient in terms of their interactions with their mighty neighbours. And when it comes down to things like votes in the UN, their ability to take a view that is more in line with their own or indeed international norms rather than being dominated by their neighbours, that's in everyone's benefit. So I think the prize is in, we've got to be very clear about this, it's in developing prosperous, secure, stable and developed countries. And that's something they want, that's something we want.
Want to add, Chris, to that briefly?
Yeah, so look, we have a description of our overall goal for the region, which is a sovereign, resilient and prosperous Central Asia. The words sovereign and resilient are important there in the context of the Russia question that you posed. Countries that are better able to manage the political, security, social and economic challenges that each country faces. And I think, as the Minister just said, the prism of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's resurgence, let's say, in its wider region is the most important prism through which we're currently looking at the region. I can say a little bit more about how this fits into a wider strategy on Russia in the closed session that we'll have briefly after this. But just digging a level deeper into what this means we try to do in the region in order to deliver its ongoing stability and institutional strength. We focus very much on supporting better economic governance in the region, boosting political reform, promoting therefore democracy, prosperity and human rights, boosting too trade and investment between the UK and the countries of the region, something that comes right at the top of their list of priorities for their relationships with us.
Thank you. So, Minister, it's obviously a very big region and a very diverse region with a very different set of interests. How do you prioritise your own engagement in the different nations of Central Asia? How do you just deal with that difficult question of where to spend the time?
Well, as the junior minister responsible for this region in the department, it's my job to go to all countries, and that's what I did. I've been to all 5 Central Asian states this year, and in a way I think it's very important that there's a deliberate non-prioritisation in the sense that we've got to turn up and engage and speak to all of them, and I think it would be a justified criticism of our approach over the last 2 decades that routine engagement from government ministers travelling throughout Central Asia was not taking place, which is perplexing, as I've said, because of the fact that we were very, very significantly involved militarily just south of that region. So I've made a deliberate focus on travelling to all 5 states, and I think diplomatically it's very interesting. They're very keen to meet and talk, and it's not about me turning up and telling them what we think about Central Asia, it's about me turning up and listening on behalf of the government as to their priorities. And of course, they are very diverse, as you know. The conversations one has in Tajikistan will be different from Kazakhstan. I mean, they are, for example, in Tajikistan, some very interesting discussions about hydroelectricity and climate change. Whereas in Uzbekistan, there's a very, very significant demand for English language, it being the most populous country in the region. So I think I have a deliberately sort of equal approach in terms of determination to travel and listen. Clearly, if you look at all 5 countries in terms of their economic importance and population, clearly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are. Kazakhstan is our foremost trade partner, and Uzbekistan is the most populous and has the most potential in terms of teaching English and has the biggest demand in terms of exporting British education, if I can put it like that. But I think it's very important that we have a very equal approach in terms of engagement. And in the new geopolitical reality that we find ourselves in with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it's very interesting that these states want to have conversations that they wouldn't otherwise have had a couple of years ago.
So how undermining was it for both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary to land in the Kyrgyz Republic to refuel and not bother getting off the plane to meet their interlocutors?
Well, I think in a perfect world, clearly that it would have an opportunity might have been created, but I can't comment. It would be inappropriate for me to comment on the constraints of the Prime Minister's diary. I mean, he's an extremely busy man, and I wouldn't presume to speculate as to what he should be doing in terms of his travel arrangements. But clearly, as much top-level engagement as possible is really important, because that's what other states are doing. I know that Chris was.
It was a curious contrast, I think, to the conduct of some other foreign leaders that stopped over to refuel. But we'll perhaps turn the question around a little bit to say and ask, what are your ambitions for ministerial engagement across HMG over the next year?
Well, I'm very ambitious. I will continue travelling. I know the Foreign Secretary will be making his plans, and I think we anticipate that our attention at the highest level might be given to this region. So I can't speculate or preempt prime ministerial attention. But this is it's I think held in very high regard in terms of senior leadership.
I can give you a bit of a forward look of the things we have in the diary at the moment, if that would be helpful.
Maybe drop us a line with those.
Yeah, happy to do that. That would be easy.
That would be just in the interest of time. Minister, other countries like the US and indeed the EU have initiated a Central Asia 5 plus UK format to help conduct some of their engagement. I don't think we've done that.
We haven't.
Why not? And do we have plans to do so?
We haven't got any plans. We have an absolutely open mind. I've had discussions bilaterally about this, actually, and there is some appetite in the region. Clearly, at the moment, we're immediately focused on bilateral engagement, but I certainly don't rule it out. I'm very keen to explore it. Chris, do you want to know anything?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, some countries that have used this format may have used it once or twice. It tends to be an occasional thing rather than a very regular thing, not least because bringing all 5 foreign ministers, or indeed in some cases heads of state from the Central Asian countries together, is not a simple proposition, but certainly as and when the opportunity emerges, it's something we'd be open to.
Yeah. Just before I bring in Chris Bryant, do you want to just tell us what's been the toughest conversation that you've had in your engagement over the last period?
I think in terms of, we've had some tough conversations about human rights with foreign ministers and deputy foreign ministers in the region, and tough conversations about the war in Ukraine.
The Foreign Secretary visited Astana in February, I think, and met with Tokayev. I just wonder what came out of that, what practical result there was for the UK.
The Foreign Secretary chaired in London in December, and in fact I will be chairing the next in Astana in early October. In terms of practicalities, he signed a critical minerals MOU which is a good framework for our ongoing discussions about that issue. We also signed an MOU on green hydrogen, and there was a third on, remind me what the third was. Security, Russian invasion of Ukraine, its export of energy into Europe, 10% of oil coming from Kazakhstan, and its central role as the energy superpower of the region.
And if I may, we have just sort of, may I?
Yeah, of course.
Just looking ahead, so I think part of the question was what has come out of that meeting. It's set up a more intensified regularity of engagement between the two countries, so looking through the autumn. We have the UK-Kazakh strategic dialogue in October. We have an intergovernmental commission on trade and investment in the autumn, and we're working to finalise the sort of umbrella framework for all of our cooperation, which is called the Strategic Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which is in its final stages. And as the Minister said, all of that includes issues such as defence engagement, critical minerals, education, climate cooperation as well. We've invited Kazakhstan to join probably our flagship development programme across the region, which is called the Economic Governance and Development Programme. And so the Foreign Secretary also signed an MOU with his Kazakh opposite number to include them in that programme. And that looks at institution building to improve economic reforms, improve the business environment in short.
And was there any discussion about kleptocracy in Kazakhstan?
Yeah, there's discussions about sanctions evasion, particularly, and kleptocracy, and we have been impressed by the steps taken by the Kazakhs in terms of their own financial conduct authority, in terms of making sure that Kazakh banks are not a repository for money that is sanctioned or money connected to sanctioned individuals.
It's an important part of our
it's an ongoing
conversation with the Kazakhs, including helping them to do as much as they possibly can to push back on the domestic risks from corruption and money laundering. That includes through the use of the Astana International Financial Centre as a legal platform using English law to allow for commercial transactions to take place without some of the risks that might otherwise be apparent. And of course, in terms of our own actions back here in the UK to clamp down on any illicit finance that we see to have made its way to these shores, there have been a number of individual cases that I'm sure the committee is aware of.
Well,
yes,
we had yes, anyway, don't tempt me. But we had a rather less optimistic view when we were in Kazakhstan of the attempts to tackle corruption, because a broadly autocratic system that hasn't quite decided how much it's going to allow checks and balances is intrinsically more likely to lead to financial corruption. And we faced quite a few British companies, or we were being told about quite a lot of British companies who were saying that one of the difficulties is it's difficult to do safe trade.
I mean, for what it's worth, I recognise that characterisation, and it's for exactly that reason that we have placed very high priority on investment in building economic reforms, transparency. E-government, e-procurement is one example I would give as having been particularly effective by requiring, for example, in the case of procurement, the whole process to be transparent and online, thus eliminating many of the opportunities for corruption that otherwise exist in the process. But you're right about the broader context.
Just on sanctions evasion, one of the things that the Kazakhs were saying to us fairly frequently was, one of our difficulties is that our route for everything used to be through St. Petersburg, and it can't be now. What work has the UK government done on trying to assist alternative routes through to the West for products and materials, bearing in mind that the Caspian Sea is a very costly route?
That would be the ultimate, the middle corridor, which the EBRD have done some conceptual work on. I mean, that's certainly something of interest, but that's decades away. Please.
So sanctions circumvention, and it's sort of two parts to that question. Firstly, on sanctions circumvention, we're very actively engaged with the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks in recent months. So 2 visits to the region to both of those countries, one at senior level in the spring and then a group of experts in Kazakhstan in July. An extremely positive reception, very constructive conversations and very real signs of progress, I would say, in both countries on the problem. The second part of your question was about alternative routes for goods in and out of Central Asia. The Minister mentioned the middle corridor, and there is, as you would expect, increasing attention being paid in both government circles and in industry to developing that middle corridor. As you say, the infrastructure is not at this stage anything like sufficient for it to be a serious volume route into and out of Central Asia, including for hydrocarbons as well as freight trade. However, politically, the G7, you may have spotted earlier this summer, included a statement in its communiqué on its commitment to developing that route, so trying to send the right sorts of political signals. And we are also speaking to some of the major commercial players and the regional governments who would need to be involved in the infrastructure investments required, particularly in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, to develop the Trans-Caspian route.
I've got 2 quick other security ones, if that's all right, Chair. Yeah, one is on water security, because obviously if you dam up a river that starts in one country so as to provide water to your people and you thereby prevent water getting to the next country, that is potentially a source of massive conflict in the future. What discussions have you had about that? I'll just bung them both in. And the other is about Afghanistan, because obviously Kyrgyzstan has played a significant role the region really has played a significant role in trying to have some kind of discussions with the Taliban. I'm not sure that we're quite as keen on the Taliban's efforts in Afghanistan as the chair of the Defence Committee was, but or indeed as you, Minister, no doubt. Just how important is the region to discussions about Afghanistan for the UK?
On that, Sir Chris, it's of central importance, and we do have a good dialogue with Central Asian states about our shared security concerns in Afghanistan, and we recognise their deep and long-standing expertise as neighbours and as countries with a real concern about the potential spread of extreme groups on the fringes of the Taliban, if you like, endangering their own people. So that's a very active discussion. I had good discussions about regional security during my visit there. So that's sort of something that's of great value to us and to Central Asian states.
And water, because you stood in front of the dam.
I was going to do water. So, yes, obviously, very much an issue for the region for the reasons you gave, and also a topic of conversation with most of the governments of the region, if not all. On the specific topic of dams, obviously the issue is during the dam fill period, and we have encouraged countries upstream to have constructive conversations with countries downstream about how water is managed during that fill period as well as afterwards. So we're noting, of course, that major dam projects that bring hydroelectric potential have significant economic opportunity too for the region, particularly Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, where otherwise economic opportunities are relatively limited, and that's something that, as you may have gathered in the region, we've been looking programmatically to support through a programme called CASA 1000. We're also...
Troubling if it's all paid for by China.
I'm sorry?
Troubling if it's all paid for by China.
True, and so... The CASA 1000 programme is a World Bank consortium of funders, of which the UK has been a major part, and therefore definitely not just China. We're also, for what it's worth, working through a multi-donor World Bank programme. There are a series of international initiatives tend to go through the multilaterals that support better water resource management across the region. Because as you will have found, as well as the dams problem, there's a significant issue with water management, in particular irrigation canalisation that isn't always efficient or as efficient as it could be, and significant water loss causing downstream desertification issues. So getting that water management right, improving the Soviet-era infrastructure that causes the problems is a very big focus of our work with multilateral organisations in the region.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, what results have you seen from anti-money laundering capacity building in the Central Asian countries?
Anti-money laundering. Well, I think so. In Kazakhstan, what we have seen is quite a robust response in terms of their approach to ensuring that the management of their banking system is free of that. They are very keen to ensure. They are very keen to ensure that they are definitely taking.
Capacity building there as well, and have they been receptive?
Have you got any programs in other Central
So we certainly have done with Uzbekistan, but I think it's better if we write to you with some details on that, if that's okay.
Winston.
Thank you, Chairman. Is there any conditionality placed on developing in-country trading arrangements, such as human rights, governance, or environmental in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan? And if so, what are the red lines, and how would the government want to enforce those?
Assistance program. Capacity.
Includes, based on the evidence, reforms to the labour code, development of a code on youth rights and the green economy, and strengthening civil society in key economic sectors. We've looked at women's empowerment across the region. That includes building women-led small enterprises. It includes including more generally women's participation in the workforce. On the question of conditionality, I think the best example I can point to, because generally our aid programmes in this space are not conditional per se, but the Developing Countries Trading Scheme that you will have heard about, which is a set of trade preferences that have been extended to developing countries, including in the region Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, includes a set of expectations or requirements relating to the main human rights conventions, as well as some broader conventions. And if there are systematic violations of those countries' commitments under those conventions on human rights, then trading preferences under the DCTS, the Developing Countries Trading Scheme, can be suspended.
And I mean, that's all very worthy, and it's all very British and all to be expected. But how is that received by, in country, in people of authority in the countries that we're discussing?
In my experience, it's received well because they actually want institutional development. They want a properly functioning, just economy that allows entrepreneurs to create wealth and people to be employed, and doesn't see the tax base being embezzled by people who don't want it to go to the for the greater good for the population. So, in my experience, it's received well. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, no, I mean, the Developing Countries Trade Scheme in particular is a global offer, and it's a very generous set of preferences, and we haven't received significant pushback from the recipient countries on the basis of that element of potential, if you like, conditionality. On the broader question of how we approach the countries, as I think you heard from the previous witness, programmatic offers in areas where the government has particular focus, for example, reducing corruption, economic empowerment, are a way into some of the harder conversations that we want to have. And in many countries of the region in recent years, we have been pushing at a relatively open door in building institutions and capacity in many areas of human rights.
And to talk about human rights then, Minister, if I may, what human rights discussions did you have or have you had with your opposite numbers in your recent visits?
Yes, I had them across the board, pretty much, and we're very happy to have a frank discussion, and we speak respectfully but clearly, and they listen. And I think what's interesting is that they are keen to ensure that they improve the situation. They do recognise the reputational risk internationally that poor human rights can have. And when it comes to the case of, for example, Uzbekistan with regard to historic use of child labour in the cotton harvest, that was something that, through working with allies, actually they managed to reduce by a very large degree. Our approach is to talk very candidly in private and to point out the necessity and the justice and the benefit of ensuring that human rights are protected. But what's interesting is when you have these conversations that they actually get it themselves. And the example I've given is a case where they wanted to change because they recognised that it was useful to them, it was good for their people and good for the economy, and also very important for their international reputation. And of course you have a much more better understanding of that.
No. I mean, but veteran of many of these conversations too. I just want to sort of make clear that for all that we're saying, there are relatively constructive conversations that we can have. We remain clear that we have significant human rights concerns across the region. In particular, I would highlight freedom of expression and freedom of political involvement as being the two areas where there's been least progress across the region.
So Chris, do you want to just
now, my understanding
extend this into some questions about forced labour, please?
My understanding is that you're intending to table amendments to the Modern Slavery Act to tackle forced labour in supply chains from countries such as Turkmenistan. Is that right?
I wasn't aware of that, but I could find out.
So it certainly remains our intent to focus on the question of forced labour in supply chains in the right sorts of ways in our engagement with Turkmenistan.
But we're not sure. I don't know about I can't comment on the amendments.
Sounds like you're at the edge of your knowledge on this area, which is fine. I'm not having a go, but
I'm happy to admit that I don't understand. I'm not aware of the amendments that you talk about.
Okay, well, I mean, there's not much point in my asking more on that then, I think. But it'd be really good if you could write to us on that, because it's one of the areas of human rights, significant human rights concerns.
Yeah, very happy to do that.
Okay, Sakya.
In terms of early warning analysis for what's happening in Central Asian countries, have there been any indications of any future atrocities?
Future atrocities?
Yes. Are any countries at risk of future atrocities at the moment?
Like what? What do you mean?
In terms of human rights atrocities, what's your early warning analysis telling you in those countries?
So, for example, you think about the civil disturbances in places like Osh that cost the lives of many people not so long ago. I mean, are there other risks like that loom large on your risk register for the region?
Obviously, the Kyrgyz-Tajik border remains probably the most likely source of instability within the region. We saw conflict there last year. We're pleased that the presidents of both countries in, I think it was June, were able to get together and that there is diplomatic progress. We do our best to address the consequences of that conflict through programmatic activity under what is known as the CSSF. I'm sure you'll have come across that, the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, looking, for example, at the impact on women and girls of that localised conflict on the Kyrgyz-Tajik border. A lot of the issues there are long-standing, some of them centuries old, and relating to access to water and pastures, and of course confused further by the complex border arrangements that these countries inherited from the Soviet Union. So we also have some close dialogue on counter-terrorism-associated risks with some of the countries in the region. I'd rather go into a bit more detail on that in the closed session afterwards, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up to that, I mean, just in terms of in-country staff, what kind of training do they receive and what support do they get in terms of where atrocities may occur?
We have boosted, firstly, I think I might mention...
that's important. Well, first and foremost, it's important to note that we have boosted the number of people on the ground. So that's important. There are more people across our missions in all 5 countries, even in just over the last 5 years, which you'll be able to talk about, Chris.
Yeah, no, Uzbekistan, we've doubled the number of UK-based staff in the last few years, which makes me a bit annoyed because I wanted more when I was ambassador there. Mm-hmm. But to include certainly members of staff from parts of government who are expert on the issues that you have just alluded to, particularly in the security space. So the footprint in some of the key countries of the region in the security space with relevant skills has been increasing, yes.
Do you want to move on to climate?
Yeah, just going to move on to resources and climate change and onto Turkmenistan. And the issue of methane emission and climate change. What kind of support is going in to support Turkmenistan on that?
So when I was in Turkmenistan recently, that was one of the main focuses of discussion. They understand that they've got a very significant problem that it would be in their interest to address. We would like to work with them, and we had a good discussion about that. Clearly, we're still in the foothills of any kind of meaningful collaboration, but it was very good that we've had an opportunity to talk about this. So I think that will be only more important as we move forward, and we'll keep it on the agenda.
One specific thing we're doing last year and this year, is supporting the update, actually this year and next year, supporting the update of Turkmenistan's national inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. That's using FCDO international programme funding, and obviously that will, we hope, look particularly at the problem of methane emissions, to which I think you're alluding. And as the Minister has said, it is a talking point in all of our high-level ministerial conversations.
Thank you. And just broadening out Central Asia and talk about renewable energy. What's the offering in Central Asia, and how does it differ to what we do with the Gulf states?
So I didn't quite get the question.
Well, in terms of how we're supporting them to develop renewable energy.
Oh, got it. Okay, yeah. So we have a strong appetite. The Foreign Secretary signed a green hydrogen MOU with Kazakhstan, and I think clearly there's an awareness in Kazakhstan as a major hydrocarbon exporter. There's an understanding that if they can increase their renewable output, they could become a renewable that could have a very significant impact in their own climate goals, but also their economic prosperity, because all 5 countries are suffering the dire consequence of climate change. And I think do you have programmes that attend to that?
Yes, a couple on renewable energy. In particular, I mentioned the significant investment we've made in developing Tajik and Kyrgyz hydroelectric resources through a programme called CASA 1000. We're also currently developing a new regional programme which will focus on climate, energy and water security across the whole region, including further efforts to take advantage of the significant hydroelectric potential in the region. The final thing I would say is that DBT's regional work, including through its trade directors in both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, has pivoted towards renewable energy in the energy sector from the fossil fuel sector almost entirely over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think the other part of it was what's the difference in our offering to Central Asia versus the Gulf states?
Versus the Gulf, yes.
I mean, actually, globally, DBT has pivoted, and that would include in the Gulf, to focus much more on renewable energy, and you're probably familiar with this, really away from the fossil fuel sector. So I wouldn't describe that as a difference.
Is there greater opportunity in Central Asia now?
In renewable energies? Yeah. Certainly, the opportunity there, as elsewhere, is increasing significantly. One important area of opportunity, I think particularly true in Central Asia, is around energy efficiency, because the region inherited really inefficient infrastructure historically. It's amongst the least energy efficient consumers of energy in the world, and that's true of gas infrastructure as well as electricity infrastructure. So there are major investment opportunities in up-to-date transmission infrastructure that could make a very significant difference. That's probably more of a focus of our efforts in Central Asia than it might be in the Middle East.
Can I just move on then to our strategy for influence? So we heard a lot, both in the panel just earlier, but also while we were travelling through the region, that better use of soft power is a huge opportunity for the UK. One of the ambassadors in the region described English as a strategic enabler. Yeah. We've heard about how fostering a more creative economy, spreading English language teaching, the work of the Chevening Scholarship Programme, and the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme are all really important levers. Obviously, the British Council has been skinned to the bone in the region, less and less funding. So could you just tell us a little bit about how you see the role of our institutions like the British Council and, for example, our institutions like universities? And how do you see the forecast for funding for them and the stability of their funding over the next few years to help them expand what seems like some extraordinary work?
It is extraordinary work. It's hugely important. There's a very big demand for it, as you will have seen. They already reached an amazing number of people, 2.8 million people in Kazakhstan in 21-22, and teaching and training a large number of teachers, 2,500 in Kazakhstan in that period and 4,000 in Uzbekistan. And I've met the staff in, for example, Tashkent. So it's hugely important. There's a huge appetite for it, and it is a huge strategic enabler, especially when it is coupled with the export of other forms of British education, like University of Westminster and others that are fulfilling the desire of young Uzbeks to receive a sort of global standard of education. Clearly, budgets are tight. But it is a priority, and we will always seek to have more resource going there. But we recognise it is hugely important, and you will know that from your time as ambassador, not just in Uzbekistan but elsewhere.
How are you going to de-risk the work of the British Council for the future? Because I'll be honest, I mean, the takeaway I had from listening to them is that the funding is kind of so cut now, but it's also so unpredictable. I mean, they wouldn't put it in these terms, but it sounded to me like they're at risk of really kind of falling below a critical threshold of what they can do. How do you guard against that risk?
Well, we've got to be clear. I mean, over the spending review period 22-25, we will provide the British Council with £511 million
globally.
Yeah. So it is a substantial budget. Clearly, Central Asia is compelling in terms of its importance, in terms of significant demand signal, and so that's a balancing act of management, and that's about us ensuring that we have we give it a priority that it needs.
Yeah, I mean the settlement is there across the SR period. The size and the model for how the British Council uses its money overseas is fundamentally a decision for the Council. Yeah. What we do is help them prioritise, and I certainly, with the Council, underline the importance of investment in Central Asia. You know, as the Minister said, I couldn't be more of an advocate for their work in the region from my time in the region. They're tremendously impactful, certainly in Uzbekistan and in Kazakhstan, where they retain UK-led on-the-ground presence and very significant impact, both programmatically as well as in English language teaching, training the teachers, updating the curriculum, doing the examining. Their profile across the countries is hugely impressive. And don't underestimate either their digital footprint and impact, where their audience reach is also truly impressive.
But is your steer then that they should be investing more of that 550 million in Central Asia?
That's for them to decide.
But what's your steer to them, as it were?
Well, I think there's a compelling case for putting more resource into Central Asia.
What about the BBC World Service? I mean, in terms of just making sure that people in Central Asia have got access to the truth, there's very few alternatives that are better than the BBC World Service. I think the BBC World Service has got the grand total of one journalist in Uzbekistan. How do we think about expanding the footprint of the BBC World Service on the ground in Central Asia?
So firstly, actually securing access to Uzbekistan for that BBC World journalist took some time, and I'm not sure how easy it would necessarily be to increase the numbers over a period of time. However, I do view it as extremely important that we retain a strong BBC offering to audiences across the region. That includes, as the BBC, as you will know, has shifted its output from radio towards digital content, making sure that digital content going out in the form of podcasts in Kyrgyz and Uzbek continues to hit the audiences that we need to hit, as well as the languages that are still used across the region, including Russian, to make sure that we're using the asset that the BBC offers to counter some of the disinformation that otherwise permeates the region in that language.
So in 5 years' time, say, would it be your hope that there's a bigger BBC World Service presence in Central Asia?
It would seem logical in the sense that there is a growing young population that demand the content. So it would seem logical.
Yeah, I have to say I was stunned by the market for Peaky Blinders in Uzbekistan. Obviously, as a Birmingham MP, that is something I want to encourage. But I mean, what's the realistic scale of ambition for expanding BBC World Service in the region? I mean, should we be trying to double it, triple it? I mean, given the importance of English as a strategic enabler and the BBC as a trusted news brand in a world where disinformation is rife, what's the kind of ambition level that we should be thinking about?
There's a robust ambition, and I think this is all in the context of the changed security context of the last year and a half. These are archetypal middle states, using the Foreign Secretary's terminology. There is a competition of ideas. It's a contested region in that regard, and turning up with not just English language but also world service is very important. So I think there's certainly an institutional ambition, notwithstanding our...
To give another example, where, if you like, the budgets are more directly within my control, our control, so Chevening is a good example. Mm-hmm. We're increasing Chevening scholarships from 23 last year across the region to 31 this year across the region. So perhaps it's an indication of the sort of ambition that we would have wherever we are able to boost the numbers of staff and the allocation of resources in line with our wider strategy.
Okay. What about the seasonal agricultural worker scheme? Has that been a good thing, a force for good?
A very good thing. More than 12,000 have participated. It's been a great opportunity for them. It's been very good for our economy. And I think in terms of the people-to-people links and the understanding that these people acquire of the United Kingdom, I think it's a very, very good thing.
What conversations have you had with the Home Secretary about expanding that scheme?
I think we definitely keep that under review.
So when it's reviewed annually, and every year our pitch to the Home Office is to continue it and to expand it as much as there is capacity to do so in the broader scheme. The advantages of it, of course, are not limited to growing the people-to-people links and to the skills that these workers bring back to the countries, but also in that we offer an alternative to migration to Russia, which is the very significant worker migration flow, as you will know, from the region, and to the extent that it forms a dependency, a very significant dependency for some of the countries of the region where very significant proportions of GDP in both Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are contingent on remittances sent back from those workers. So
it's a compelling case. I mean, really so what's the Home Office said back to you? I remember as 2 years as a Home Office Minister, the relationship between the Home Office and the Foreign Office is always one of total harmony. So,
well, that's the case today. I'm pleased.
How are you getting on?
No, well, and
so on this one, it's. I mean, careful. It's a relatively rare meeting of minds, I would say, in that there are strong domestic reasons to want to expand this route for seasonal workers. The programme overall has expanded from 2,500 to 40,000 visas from 2,500 in 2019 to 40,000 in 2022. That's global, but Central Asian workers make up significantly the largest contingent of that, which is interesting in and of itself. And the experience has been overwhelmingly positive from pretty much every perspective, in that the overstay rates, for example, have not been of significant concern to the Home Office, and therefore they have been ready and able to expand that scheme, and we too have been keen to see it expanded over the period.
Will it continue to expand in your estimation?
I would not be willing to commit to that, because I honestly don't have a good sense of where the Home Office will come out next year, but that would be my hope.
That would be your hope, okay. And then in terms of coordination with allies, can you just, Minister, tell us a little bit about the kind of conversations that you're having with partners like the US and the EU? We were very struck when we were in the region by the tempo of engagement from the US and a number of significant European partners. What kind of conversations do you have? What kind of coordination mechanisms do you have? And how do you see that evolving?
No, you make a good point, and actually, on my recent visit, the EU summit had just happened actually in Kyrgyzstan, so it was on the agenda. So we do coordinate with allies. I had a very good discussion with Terry Hochler before I went, the EU Special Representative, and so we do liaise with our allies and like-minded countries as a matter of course, because we share the same priorities across the region.
So one good example is that those visits to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that I mentioned relating to sanctions circumvention were joint with our EU and US counterparts, as well as the Minister's own engagement with the EU Special Representative. There's a more sort of systematic group that is chaired by that EU Special Representative, and that we join, as well as US, Japanese and South Korean counterparts. That's obviously focused on Central Asia. Coordinate through the G7, work closely with Central Asian states at the United Nations. You may have gathered there's a UN Regional Centre for Preventive Diplomacy for Central Asia called the UNRCCA that we engage with on a multilateral basis too. And the OSCE is probably the last one I'd mention as a very significant player in the region, and coordination with both other OSCE members in terms of programmatic support for the OSCE missions in the region, +2 with the countries of Central Asia under the OSCE umbrella more broadly.
The dialogue includes trade?
So the dialogue with certainly our EU partners would include trade, yeah.
Sanctions evasion?
Yep.
Human rights?
Yep. We'd be sharing pretty much the whole agenda. I mean, the agenda will vary from meeting to meeting, but I don't think it's bound. It would address, whatever the issues that anybody wanted to bring to the table might be.
And then, Minister, would you say that the lack of engagement before your arrival, by the sound of it, has left us at the back of the pack of our international partners, which was the summary description given to us?
No, I think
evidence.
I think not, because of the unique interest they have in British culture and English language, and also an acknowledgement that in terms of our approach, our diplomatic approach, I think they regard us as a partner that is willing to listen and cooperate rather than dictate. So I think back of the pack is not quite the right way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, we for some years, one of the first countries for a long time, one of only 4 or 5 to have diplomatic missions in all 5 Central Asian countries. And although engagement has sort of risen and fallen through the years, we've had at least consistent engagement and structured engagement with most of the countries of the region throughout the period. So I'd agree back of the pack is unfair.
So it feels like this is also quite a fast-moving and fairly fluid foreign policy, because there's been a lot of change over the last year, and it's obviously all kinds of opportunities lie ahead in the year to come. How do you think the government can now begin crystallising the long-term direction, objectives, both for trade but also the other agendas that we've talked about today? How do you create a real kind of clarity of signals?
Yeah, so I think from our part, we are the diplomats, so our job within that is to show that clarity of signal by turning up regularly, listening and discussing shared priorities, and also receiving the leadership of all of these countries in King Charles Street and in our capital, and discussing those same things. So it's got to go both ways. So I think we've got to embed a much more routine schedule of diplomatic engagement and diplomatic hospitality for their leadership coming here.
Yeah, and so we're putting in place quite deliberately frameworks for our relationships with each country. I'll very quickly run through those. So with Kazakhstan, I mentioned the Strategic Partnership and Cooperation Agreement that we are currently in the final stages of negotiating. We've had a regular ministerial dialogue with the Kazakhs since 2013. With the Uzbeks, we have a partnership and cooperation agreement signed in 2019, and there's annual ministerial strategic dialogue talks too. With the Tajiks, we have a political dialogue. First one of those was in March this year. You led, signing an MOU, formalising that. And Lord Ahmad, back in 2022, initiated the first political dialogue with Turkmenistan. We have the first one planned with Kyrgyzstan probably later this year. Which you agreed.
Yeah.
And sorry.
And I'm travelling back to Kazakhstan in early October.
Yeah. Is there now more that we can do to ensure that the business community is clearer and has heard those signals about the future trade opportunities? I don't know whether you see it as government's job to help drive business growth and trade growth in the region, or whether, frankly, that's down to business to get their act together. But how do we make sure that the business community has heard the strategic ambition and intention, do you think?
I think it's absolutely part of our role, and we have DBT people in missions in all of these countries, and a huge amount of work done here. And there are things like, for example, in the case of Uzbekistan, the annual meeting of UBTIC, which in this year will be in London. But so it's absolutely part of our core business, and officials liaise very closely with DBT colleagues on that.
Yeah. So with both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, we have sort of government structures that support annual business and government meetings, where, if you like, government helps provide a platform for businesses to meet and engage, and helps to explain what we think the opportunities might be within the countries concerned. As you will know, DBT has export advisors around the countries who are able to access around the UK, who are able to access the expertise that sits out in the international network and help inform British exporters of the opportunities that exist in the countries of the region as well. So there's a significant amount of government support to making that happen. I would say, though, that businesses, in my experience, listen most to the other businesses that are already present in the markets of the region, and that all of this works best when they are not simply hearing from governments, for all that we play a role in pointing to the opportunities, but they're hearing from businesses where there's already presence. And Kazakhstan is a really good example of that working successfully, where you have a couple of very big investments, Shell in oil and gas, BA's investments in Air Astana, that pull with them supply chains that build the sort of ecosystem where British businesses follow one another in and create really quite significant trading relationships.
And we have those structures in Kazakhstan, but I mean, is there a plan to expand the availability of those structures across the region?
So by structures, there's an intergovernmental structure in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Those are the two countries where we see the most significant trade growth opportunities.
Yeah. I'm conscious you've got a Westminster Hall debate to get to, so we can...
Okay, but Chris will stay with you.
Yeah, we're grateful for that. So, Minister, thank you so much. Indeed, we'll end the public session there. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.